While President Xi Jinping may have decided to skip the G20 summit in India for the first time since taking power in 2012, but his country's shenanigans are definitely dominating the agenda, sending a clear and unequivocal message while addressing the elephant, rather the dragon in the room, seeking effective code of conduct for South China Sea at the ASEAN meet. Prime Minister Modi said that the international laws are applicable to all nations without naming China, that has been drawing global flack for its expansionist agenda. India said that all in the Indo-Pacific must stick to the rules.
हमारी हिस्ट्री और ज्योग्राफी भारत और आसियान को जोड़ते हैं, साथ ही साझा वैल्यूज, क्षेत्रीय एकता, शांति, समृद्धि और मल्टीपोलर वर्ल्ड में साझा विश्वास भी हमें आपस में जोड़ता है। आज वैश्विक अनिश्चितताओं के माहौल में भी हर क्षेत्र में हमारे आपसी सहयोग में लगातार प्रगति हो रही है। यह हमारे संबंधों की ताकत और रेजिलियंस का प्रमाण है।
Now, this is something that has found resonance among other nations as well, which were alarmed by the map released by China, claiming territory which is not rightfully theirs. In fact, across the world, every single country has come out in condemnation of what they say is absurd claims to territory made by China. But what really is going to be on the agenda when it comes to all the G20 countries when they sit across the table and discuss the past, present and future relations with China? Bhaswati Mukherjee, former diplomat, joining us along with Captain Alok Bansal, Director at the India Foundation, Dr. Swasti Rao, Associate Fellow at the Manohar Parrikar IDSA, and Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics, University College, Dublin. Bhaswati Mukherjee, I want to start with you first. Most people would agree, even if Xi is not in the room, the shadow of China definitely is. What should all the G20 countries do to ensure that China is kept in check?
Well, first of all, let me clarify that as an Indian diplomat on the verge of the G20 summit led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, I don't think that Xi Jinping's shadow or China's shadow is in the room at all. This is a multilateral grouping of the most important economies. The Chinese Prime Minister is here, and Prime Minister Modi very correctly articulated the concerns not only of India but of China's neighbours at the ASEAN Summit, when, as you rightly pointed out, he talked about the rule-based order and the timing of the map under any circumstance was so clumsily timed by the Chinese to bring out such a map on the eve of a G20 summit, on the eve of the ASEAN summit, just after the BRICS, conveyed a totally wrong impression of a kind of neo-Chinese imperialism, expansionism, aggression, disregard for their neighbors, etc. This is the land of the elephant. If the dragon wants to come, he's welcome. If he doesn't want to come, that's too bad. But the G20 final declaration, the New Delhi declaration, is all but finalized by the Sherpas, which includes the Chinese Sherpa and the Russian Sherpa. There is a missing paragraph, a couple of lines with regard to Ukraine. And here I would like to underline, as Amitabh Kant, our Sherpa, has repeatedly said, the G20 is an economic grouping. It's a developmental grouping, and India has brought in the African Union with a strong endorsement of many countries that they should be part of the G20, with the message that Udhara Charita Namatu Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, it is for the generous-hearted that the world is one family. Prosperity must be shared to become more prosperous. That's India's message. And if you look at the New Delhi declaration tomorrow, you will see that many of the unique points in the declaration emanate from Prime Minister's vision for a developed India, a developed world, and a developed Africa with shared prosperity. So even if tomorrow there is no consensus on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It really doesn't matter, because if there is an issue which has divided the permanent members of the Security Council, how can it be resolved in an economic grouping of the world's most powerful countries, which is intended to discuss economics, development, climate change, etc.? I'm not saying that at the last minute something may or may not be possible. I'm just saying that it should not be looked at as a hiccup, because it's not a hiccup. It's not intended to be a political document. It's intended to be a document focusing on economics, development, etc., where we have brought in such interesting innovations, whether it is the digital public infrastructure or it's the issue of a global alliance on biofuels. Just as we had brought up the Solar Alliance, Prime Minister Modi had done that. And of course, let's not forget that the very important bilaterals which are taking place. There was a very important one with the head of state of Mauritius. There's going to be a very important bilateral this evening over the one-to-one dinner with Prime Minister Modi and Joe Biden. And many of these issues will be discussed, including, I'm sure, the whole issue of how to contain China and China's aggression. And therefore, if China chooses, if Xi Jinping decides that he will not go to the ASEAN Summit because he doesn't want to face them after that wrong map, if he doesn't want to come to China, to come to India because he's claiming Indian territory as his own territory, well, the boot polish is on his face, not ours. He decided not to come. He decided to send the Prime Minister, and he will have to accept the consequences of the kind of expansionist ambitions that he has betrayed through those maps, because all China's neighbors are up in arms. In the South China Sea, he has made claims, preposterous claims, which have been turned down by the International Court of Justice, including with regard to the Philippines, etc. So I think, all in all, we should just not discuss China at all. We should focus on the glorious day ahead of us tomorrow, when we're going to have a new declaration delivered.
Absolutely, let's do that. For the longest time, India was hyphenated with Pakistan. Now, great urge is there to do the same with China. But many analysts, like the former diplomat Bhaswati Mukherjee, says China is only incident to the equation that we enjoy with other G20 countries. What would be your expectation from the summit and the presidency of India? Scott Lucas.
I don't think China will be publicly the central issue of the G20. I think despite the rather ill-tempered rhetoric that's come out of China, it's notable that in its English language newspapers today, there's no mention of the G20. So they're not even putting a priority on it. I think there'll be private discussions in terms of the region, in terms of China. Those will be discussions not only about, of course, security issues, but discussions about economic issues, for example. And that, of course, fits in with India's public approach to try to build its economic links and to diversify them, including with Europe and with the United States. I think, as previous guests said, you're certainly going to have a number of global issues that are going to be important, which are economic cooperation, climate change, biosecurity, health security after the pandemic. But where I do think a little bit of a different take here, Ukraine's going to be a central issue as well. I mean, I can understand the reason why to play down the idea that if there is not a joint statement, this is not a defeat, this is not significant. But it's not just the US and Europe, it's a number of other countries now that are looking to get all the G20, including India, on board with a statement which says, look, it is time to call out the Russian invasion for what it is, an invasion. It is time to call on Russia to cease fire, indeed to pull back its occupying troops, and to come to the negotiating table. Because the longer that this Russian aggression goes on, the more intense the global damage is. I think India has moved in a little bit on its position, for example, cutting back its oil purchases from Russia. China has definitely pulled back from Moscow in recent months. And notably, and this is what I'm watching, the Saudis. Saudi Arabia is trying to play more of a broker's role, as it did a few weeks ago with the conference in Riyadh, which is to say, look, we need a solution here, which actually calls out the fundamental, which is the violation of Ukraine's sovereignty.
Captain Alok Bansal, would you want to respond to that? I saw you smiling at the mention of Russia.
Well, there is no doubt that China is going to be only a peripheral issue as far as this G20 summit is concerned, because Chinese Prime Minister is attending, although Xi Jinping is not coming. And as External Affairs Minister rightly said, it's a country's prerogative as to who represents them at such a summit. But the fact is that China's aggressive stance has been criticized by all its neighbors and has been shown by you all. So I have no doubts that the most important issue that this probably G20 summit would be discussing is going to be Russia-Ukraine war, which is not going to be publicly discussed, but its overhang will remain as far as the joint statement that, if at all it comes out after the summit, will be based on it, because Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov very clearly said that if the statement does not represent Russia's viewpoint on Ukraine, then they are not going to be a party to it, which in effect actually vetoes any statement that comes out. I think India has been trying to mediate between the two warring sides. Unfortunately, what the media reports is that the West has not accepted India's approach to this particular issue. But Russia, of course, is going to remain a very, very major issue. Russia is a big factor as far as Western countries are concerned. Their representatives have been saying time and again that Russia is the key as far as they are concerned. How does China behave in the conference? Because why Xi Jinping has not come? It is my take is that it is purely because of internal dynamics. He feels his position is becoming a little insecure, and that's one of the reasons why he didn't want to come. Because Prime Minister is coming, and let's see how they conduct themselves, how they behave as far as other issues are concerned. Prime Minister has said very clearly that this conference needs to shift from GDP-centric to human-centric. And one of the issues is debt restructuring, where China will have to collaborate, because China has actually trapped many countries of the global south in debt trap. So when we are looking at global approach, we are trying to get the global south. India is emerging as the voice of the global south. Some amount of collaboration from China is inevitable. We would need Chinese collaboration in debt restructuring, digitalization. Prime Minister has also talked of cyber security, where we need to collaborate. Also about carbon neutral technologies, because technological development in such a way that there is no adverse impact on the globe, there is no adverse impact on the climate. All these issues, I think both, especially China and India, will have to come together, because we are the two largest developing nations as far as the globe is concerned. And I think technological innovations will have to come from here. So that's the fact. But Russian overhang to some extent will remain. And if India manages to come out with a joint statement which meets both the requirements of the Russians as well as the West, it will be a diplomatic triumph.
Dr. Swasti Rao, everyone will have expectations. The visitors will have their own expectations of what India should do. But what are India's expectations from what will be the deliverables that we get from the next 48 hours?
Right. Good evening to you, Padmaja. It's a couple of things. I think we need to put certain things into perspective, and I'm glad you asked about India's, desiderata, as in what does India want. See, the first thing is, like Ambassador Sarkar just said, that you really have to sort of push this narrative, which is the correct narrative. That look, G20 is basically a multilateral institution to improve the global economic architecture. Therefore, the key focus on of the G20, declaration, or, the final summit that we are having now, should be on the performance of the different finance track groups, the different working groups on the finance tracks, for things about debt service suspension initiatives, about climate financing, etc., etc. So there is, I think, very little disagreement on the fact that that should be the focus from India's perspective, number one. Number two, let's understand that we will not get a geopolitical consensus, a geostrategic consensus on the factor of Ukraine. I do agree with what Lucas was saying about how he's been watching the relatively neutral countries, so far that maintained a neutral stand on Russia, are also getting fed up of this war, with pretty meaningless war in many ways, that is truly pushing the world further into a deeper crisis of food, fuel, and fertilizer, particularly with respect to Russia's, a suspension of the grain deal, and especially the impact it is having on the Middle Eastern and the, in the African region. And you saw that Saudi Arabia, when it had the Jeddah talks, Russia was not an invitee. So what I'm saying is that the neutrality will remain, and I think the middle water countries are going to, play all sides and multi-align. But at the same time, there is a palpable sense of frustration about how long this is going to continue. Okay, that is the other thing. So we should not expect, any joint statement. I think it is really difficult to sort of bring everybody under the same, so to say, wording. That's number two. Number three, and a very important thing, is that I think the other important geopolitical posturing that the G20 can deliver is about the global south. Let's understand that China and India do compete for influence when it comes to who is the champion or the leader of the global south. And when Xi Jinping is not coming in person, I think it gives a very wonderful opportunity to not just European Union, but also the US, also Japan and India to actually, because we have with these partners, and especially with the European Union and Japan, several of connectivity partnerships in Africa, in Indo-Pacific, through the global gateway, through different connectivity mechanisms, etc. So I think that is also something very important. You saw that African Union will be included. That is a huge win, because let us understand that from China's perspective, I don't agree with the idea that he's not coming only because of the internal problems, because had that been the case, at least you would have had, the English-speaking dailies, the English language dailies of China mention something about the G20. They're not really talking about it at all. So the message is clear that with the BRICS expansion, China has got what it wanted, and it is not really wanting to sort of, play that role and lend its support to India's historic presidency. So I think that's clear. And the fourth thing, in my opinion, which is important, is definitely the important bilaterals. Because let's face it, India is not going to be the G20 leader from now on. We are going to be handing over the baton to the incoming president. But what is going to remain with us for sure is the kind of bilateral joint statements. And I'm sure even though we may not have a joint statement from the G20, but we are going to have a very robust joint statement when it comes to the US, when it comes to, France, when it comes to Japan, when it comes to Italy. So I think I would be really keeping an eye on that and, look at how we are intending to take forward our agendas there.
And we would definitely need all of your wisdom to help us parse those joint statements. For the time being, though, thank you very much, Dr. Swasti Rao, Bhaswati Mukherjee, Captain Alok Bansal and Scott Lucas for joining us, heading into a very, very quick break. But the arrivals continue. We'll keep a close eye on what's going on. Quick break, back in a minute. All right. In fact, the fresh images that we are getting right now are of the Prime Minister and Sheikh Hasina.